What do you think about Bryan Johnson?
I think the question of, is he slowing his rate of biological aging? I think it really boils down to the question of, is improving health the same as reversing biological aging?
Do we have an idea of what instigates aging yet?
Yeah, we have some ideas, but there's a lot more to learn. A diet higher in protein is probably net beneficial over a diet low in protein. Get the diet quality piece figured out first, then worry about protein.
Calorie restriction should cause people to lose weight consistently, but I guess this is not the point.
We have to think about what we know from animal studies versus human data. And in those cases, the way those experiments are typically done. My name is Matt Caberline, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. All right, hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. Today we have a special episode as we hit 5,000 subscribers on YouTube. We're going to do an AMA. Nick has gone through, along with Tara, and collected a bunch of questions that people have posted, and we're gonna run through them and try to give our best answers. And so we're racing on towards 10,000. When we get to 10,000, we'll do something else special. I don't know what it'll be at this point. Maybe we'll have an in-person here in Seattle. I don't know. We'll do something cool. As you can see, we're also starting to get some Optispan podcast swag. So I've got the shirt, got the coffee mugs. We'll be rolling out a couple of other interesting swag items, and we'll do some giveaways at some point. Nice. for our viewers. So if you're not yet a subscriber, jump down, subscribe to the podcast. When we get to 10,000, we're going to do some cool stuff. All right, let's take it away. So Nick is going to hit me with some questions, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, so on this episode, we find out, what grade level my reading ability is at. So lots to read. So first question is from the episode Flaws in the Healthcare System, and is, if medication is reducing adiposity in muscles, yet you are maintaining the same strength and loss in lean mass, how does this affect longevity? The medication I'm referring to is metformin.
Yeah, so I think there are several pieces here that are a little bit challenging to answer precisely. So first of all, how it affects longevity is a guess, right? I keep saying this, but it's important for people to understand we don't have anything proven to impact human longevity. So I would suggest when we're thinking about muscle function, muscle mass, muscle composition, function is probably most important. And by function, I mean, can you lift a certain amount of weight? Can you create a certain amount of force? Can you do the activities of daily living you want to do? So I'd put that at the top. I think the question of whether or not metformin actually reduces fat in muscle is still a little bit of an open question. And so I would not assume that in an individual, metformin is actually reducing fat in muscle. In general, the infiltration of fat into muscle with age is part of sarcopenia and generally not thought to be a good thing. So if it is the case that a medication is reducing adiposity of fat, attenuating sarcopenic tendencies, that's probably a good thing for longevity. I'm not sure metformin actually does that for most people. So it's a little bit of a disconnect there.
I think a better approach could be just do cardio and like with a rower or a air bike or places where you're using kind of more muscles. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's an either or, right? Again, I think from my perspective, metformin makes a lot of sense for people who have diabetes or pre-diabetes. Whether or not metformin makes sense for people who don't have any, impaired glucose homeostasis, I think is still an open question. I don't personally think the data strongly supports that. If it was the case that in elderly people, metformin could attenuate infiltration of fat into muscle and perhaps other tissues, that could be a positive even in non-diabetics. I'm just not sure that the data actually convincingly show that. But I agree with you. I think I would not suggest people take metformin at the expense of doing exercise. That makes absolutely no sense.
So I've been meaning to ask you. So I know a 27-year-old relatively fit female, and she does metformin. And I'm kind of surprised. She does it because of the study about how it increases longevity for diabetics. So I don't know. I wanted to get your kind of like gut reaction to if you think that's a good decision for her or not.
Yeah. Again, my view is if you're not diabetic or pre-diabetic, the balance of evidence does not support metformin for health span or longevity in humans. Now, if she's pre-diabetic or if she's diabetic or if she is taking metformin under the advice of her physician to maintain a target level of blood glucose or A1C, then it might make sense. But that's my personal opinion. And honestly, I think at that age, I don't know that it makes sense to take any prescription medication for health span purposes. My view would be to focus more on lifestyle factors, see if you can get it really dialed in that way.
Kind of what I told her is I would fear the trade-off for like the mitochondria inefficiency,
Well,
like affecting cardio, might outweigh any benefits she gets in terms of longevity.
yeah, and I mean the reality is we don't completely understand the biochemical mechanism of action for metformin. It is a mitochondrial toxin, at least at higher doses. Probably that's its primary mechanism for activating AMP kinase, which is the target people talk about for diabetes, is because it inhibits mitochondrial function. There's absolutely evidence that, again, at least in certain contexts, metformin can blunt some of the benefits of exercise. So yeah, if she's otherwise healthy, my view is it doesn't make a lot of sense for a 27-year-old. It doesn't make a lot of sense for a 47-year-old. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense for a 67-year-old if you are metabolically healthy, my personal opinion.
All right, well, thank you. So next question. It comes from the episode Reversing Biological Age. Have we finally found the answer? So what about Harold Catcher's rat SEMA? I'm a doubter by nature and a skeptic by conviction, but I was very much surprised when I heard Steve Horvath talking about it. He was clearly convinced about the reversing of the aging of the E5 elixir.
Yeah, I'm just thinking I need to get a T-shirt. Doubter by nature, skeptic by convention.
I like that.
Yeah. So I talked about this in the episode on E5. So I'd refer people to that episode if they really want to do a deep dive on E5 and SEMA. SEMA is among a group of, I think, 8 rats that are claimed to have been treated with this E5, which is the exosomal fraction of piglet blood. SEMA is the one that lived the longest. If you look at that data set, SEMA is an outlier. So is it real? Is it not? I don't know. Mistakes happen in animal facilities all the time. So the question, though, I think, is whether or not E5 or piglet exosomes or parabiosis can reverse biological age. That's based on mostly on the epigenetics. In the paper they published that Steve Horvath is a co-author on, they showed a subset of other age-related parameters that are impacted by this E5 purification or by plasma exchange. So a couple things to say there. I do believe that parabiosis, plasma exchange, and probably this exosomal fraction can improve health in old animals, okay? Is it reversing biological age? Again, this goes back to whether or not you believe that the epigenetic changes that go along with aging are equivalent to biological age. I do not believe that has been proven. I think it is premature and irresponsible for people to claim they have reversed biological aging based on that and a small number of age-related phenotypes. Steve Horvath is a very good scientist. He developed the epigenetic clocks, or at least he was involved in developing the epigenetic clocks early on. I'm sure he believes that the epigenetic clocks are a useful measure of biological age. I have not heard Steve say that he believes that E5 reverses biological age. I suspect if we were in front of an audience of scientists and I asked him that question, he would say no, he doesn't believe that it's been proven that it reverses biological age. But I don't know. We'd have to have that conversation. Steve, if you're listening, I invite you to come on the podcast. That would be an awesome conversation. So I can't comment on whether or not Steve Horvath believes that E5 reverses biological age. All I can say is, as I've said before, I do not believe that simply showing a change in the epigenetic profile or improving health is sufficient to claim that you have caused an animal to age backwards.
And one of my takeaways from that episode was even if the E5 elixir did reverse age, it wouldn't be scalable, right? In order to get that for
again, that was based on some back of the envelope math that I couldn't actually do the math right because they didn't give enough detail in the methods of that paper to allow one to actually figure out. But probably not. Like, how many piglets would you have to kill to get enough E5 to treat 1 billion people? It'd be a lot. Like, I mean, but having said that, I said this in the episode, I think figuring out the mechanisms, what are the molecules in there that are driving these apparent improvements in health in rats, that potentially is scalable. So I'm actually a big proponent of studying parabiosis and plasma exchange and exosome fractions to figure out the mechanisms. I also actually think there is some value to plasma exchange in humans. Now, again, is that scalable to the point where you could do it at the population level for health span benefits? Probably not. But for certain people, I think that plasma exchange actually can be quite valuable in terms of their quality of life. I don't know about lifespan, but so I'm pretty optimistic about this area of research. Again, I just feel like people hype and spin it in a way that is irresponsible. And again, I showed in that episode, if you compare, even if you accept everything that's been claimed about E5, the magnitude of effect is smaller than what has been done 40 years ago with caloric restriction. So it's not like this is a revolutionary, making old animals young again, right? It's important, but it is not, earth-shattering, move the field forward by that much sort of discovery. It's appropriate incremental advances, in my view.
Yeah. All right. Well, next question. So this is a good one. I think a lot of people have been asking this. What do you think about Bryan Johnson? He actually does not claim to reverse aging, which I've heard him not claim that, which I appreciate. He says that he's severely decreasing his rate of aging.
Yeah. Again, I think it depends on how you measure rate of aging, right? So. First of all, I have to be clear. I don't know Bryan Johnson personally. He's a friend of a friend, so I've heard stories about him from my friend. But I don't know him personally, and honestly, I don't really follow him. So, I can't comment in any level of detail about the content that he puts out. I think the question of, is he slowing his rate of biological aging? Again, it really depends on how confident you are that the biomarkers we have today are accurately measuring biological aging. I don't see any reason to doubt that he has had an impact on his epigenetic profile. And I absolutely believe that his biomarkers have gone in the direction we would consider being of improved health. That's exactly what you would expect for somebody who adopts a very clean lifestyle. So I think it really boils down to the question of, is improving health the same as reversing biological aging? I don't feel that it is. Can we say that you have probably slowed your biological aging? Yeah, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me, that improving lifestyle factors can slow biological aging. So I have no problem with the idea that he probably has slowed his biological aging, and the biomarkers he's using reflect that.
Okay. Do you have an opinion on the other Bryan Johnson? Do you know who that is? The Liver King? You follow him at all? They're both named Bryan Johnson. They both had a huge 2023, and it's just funny how they're on other ends.
I do not follow Liver King. I would not follow Liver King. I don't know anything about him except my recollection is from hearing, stuff that he claimed he got his physique by, was it just a carnivore diet, eating only meat?
Pretty
was
much,
it only liver? I don't know. Is that where he gets his name?
Yeah.
And then he got caught doing steroids.
Yes.
Is that essentially the take home?
Yeah, it's a take home. Yeah.
So, right. I mean, that story sort of speaks for itself.
I just love how they have the same name, but. All right, so next question. If a lifespan practice reviews a broad, comprehensive blood analysis for a 60-year-old man, and it proclaims that his biological age is 52, does that mean his blood test scores are that what you'd expect to see for a 52-year-old?
I think it depends on, so first of all, when they say lifestyle practice, I'm guessing what they mean is a longevity clinic or a medical practitioner who brands themselves as a longevity medicine practitioner. Okay, so if that's what the question is asking, it's going to depend on what they actually measured and what algorithm they used to get to biological age. So my first response is I would need to know what they did before I can comment on whether it is valid. There are algorithms that have been developed from blood analytes that are predictive for future health outcomes. Now, is that the same as biological age? Again, that's a semantic question. So one is phenoage. This is actually the paper from Morgan Levine and colleagues where they defined phenoage. They created a blood-based algorithm and an epigenetic algorithm. And so that's probably what was done here. And then the other one that I think is actually pretty cool is from a study that I was involved in along with Sue and Lee at the University of Washington, something called Enable Age. Again, That's not only blood analytes, it also looks at other metrics from NHANES, like arm circumference and things like that. But it is an algorithm that can be used to predict future health risks. So I think there's two questions here. Is it biological age? Again, I would not go there. Is it useful for predicting future health outcomes? Yeah, probably. And again, that should shock nobody. We've known that there are blood-based measures that are biomarkers of future health risk for a long time, or other measures, blood pressure, right? Lipid levels, A1C, right? So all we're doing in some ways is just refining the set of biomarkers to be more precise in terms of their ability to predict future health outcomes with some probability.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to what we were talking about before the cameras were on, which is what is optimal. So I think people want to know, like, okay, if a 20-year-old is for sure healthy, assuming they're relatively healthy, I should have the biomarkers of a 20-year-old in order to be healthy. Is that kind of the idea?
Well, with most of these, yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, with most of these biomarker panels or biological age tests, yeah, that's essentially conceptually how we look at these things, right? In other words, there are changes in many, many different things with chronological age. And in general, I think it's reasonable to say that if you can move those phenotypes to something that is more consistent with a young person, that's probably reflecting better health and biological age.
So it's not a bad thing to aim for.
Yeah, again, I mean, maybe not for everything, right? There's a lot of stuff about my 20s that probably were not optimal for health, right? There's a lot of behaviors, especially in men, women too, that are aspects of youthfulness that are not great for health. So, but yes, in general, I think that's a reasonable concept.
All right, well, next question. Would love to hear if rapamycin can slow the progression of autoimmune disease such as ankylosing spondylitis.
Yeah, okay, so this is actually a really good question. So I think there are numerous case reports suggesting that rapamycin or sirolimus, another name for rapamycin, can be beneficial for a variety of different types of autoimmune diseases. Has that gone to the level of a definitive, phase 3 randomized clinical trial? No, probably because rapamycin is off patent and there's no incentive for people to do that clinical trial. So we're sort of stuck in this middle ground where there is plenty of anecdotal evidence and individual case reports supporting the idea that at least for certain types of autoimmune disease in certain individuals, rapamycin or sirolimus can be beneficial. Does that mean it's going to be true for all autoimmune diseases? No. Does that mean it's going to work for everybody? No. But it's my belief that probably many people with autoimmune disorders can at least see alleviation of symptoms from off-label use of rapamycin. I also think it's worth mentioning, and I've said this before, I, to some extent, think of biological aging as an autoimmune disorder. And what I mean by that is, as far as we can tell, every mammal with age experiences an increase in chronic, what we call sterile inflammation. All autoimmunity is a form of sterile inflammation. It's your immune system reacting against self. So I actually think that to some extent, many, maybe all autoimmune diseases share an underlying manifestation, which is also overlapping with biological aging. That might actually be part of the reason why, a big part of the reason why rapamycin seems to be beneficial for biological aging.
Okay, by reducing sterile inflammation.
Yeah.
All right, so what's your opinion about taurine? Sounds too good to be true. Some of the claims made are it restored vision in cats that had gone blind.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the cat blindness claim. I think what I would say about taurine is, from an biological aging perspective, I would kind of put it in the second tier down in terms of things that I'm enthusiastic about. And the reason for that is that, I was involved. I was a co-author on the study. I didn't have a huge role in the study, but I did some of the experiments in my lab, where the study showed that in laboratory animals, really pretty much everywhere from worms to mice, you saw a decline in taurine levels with age, and you could supplement that back and increase lifespan. That's pretty compelling. And then they also had primate data showing that some evidence for health span improvements. And then some human data, at least in one population, that taurine levels decline with age. So it's only one study, but it was a really big study looking across multiple different organisms, suggesting that taurine supplementation can have an impact, positive impact on biological aging. So I kind of put it in this category where the data right now are pretty compelling. There's also evidence in companion animals that taurine deficiency can lead to heart disease and that you can supplement to rescue that. So I think it's intriguing. I would really like to see, additional studies validating the effects on lifespan in maybe another mouse strain. I would love to see the interventions testing program test taurine before I really jump on board and say this is something that has a lot of evidence supporting it. As a supplement, I'm not aware of any downsides. It doesn't mean there aren't. I'm not aware of any risks associated with taurine supplementation. So I kind of put it in the bucket of might be helpful, very unlikely to be harmful. So, it's an individual decision whether you would want to supplement taurine or not. I don't, for what it's worth.
It's an amino acid, correct?
Yeah.
So
it's a non-canonical amino acid. It's not one of the 20 that make up most proteins.
I see.
So it's structurally, yes.
Does the absorption get worse as people age? Is that the issue?
I don't know if that's known actually why. And again, I would also say I'm not positive that the decline in circulating taurine levels with age in people is universal. So I think there's been at least one study or one preprint since the paper in Science came out in a different population of humans that didn't see a decline in taurine. So it may really depend on, the diet, the environment, the genetics of the population being studied. But I don't know what the mechanism is. I'm not sure anybody does at this point.
All right. So next question. With the knowledge we have today and rapamycin being unavailable for most people, do you think that fisetin and Ca-AKG perhaps combined are a good alternative?
Yeah. So fisetin is a putative senolytic natural product. Calcium alpha-ketoglutarate is an intermediate in the Krebs cycle. Both have been suggested to have effects on lifespan in mice. I would not put either of those in the same class as rapamycin. And in fact, with the most recent interventions testing program paper, which I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on, I'm not sure how these episodes are going to come out, but it'll be probably around the time of this one. They actually found calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. They were not able to reproduce the lifespan extension from calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. And the intervention testing program also failed to reproduce the lifespan extension from fisetin. So, both of these had initial reports in the literature that they could increase lifespan in mice. Neither of them met the gold standard of the interventions testing program. So again, if we kind of think about, tiers of evidence, definitely fisetin I put down at least in the third tier for me, kind of like, gold standard up here, rapamycin, things that we're confident of. Things like taurine that I already mentioned that would fall maybe next level down. And then next level down is the stuff that I'm really not very enthusiastic about. Alpha-ketoglutarate, I don't know. I mean, even though it didn't extend lifespan in the ITP, I never really expected it to based on the original publication. But the data on frailty and health span from alpha-ketoglutarate I found more compelling. So for me, that's somewhere like between tier 2 and tier 3. I haven't decided yet. I think there's something there. Is it as good as rapamycin given the data we've got now? No, nowhere near that confidence level. But there might be something there for calcium alpha-ketoglutarate. The other thing about calcium alpha-ketoglutarate is that was originally developed and marketed as a calcium supplement, not an alpha-ketoglutarate supplement for bone density because it's a more bioavailable form. That's my understanding. So you might actually get the double bonus there of the calcium and the alpha-ketoglutarate when thinking about, whether it's something to add to your supplement. I don't take fisetin or calcium alpha-ketoglutarate right now. So
yeah. So I know there's metformin and some people do berberine, but there is no over-the-counter substitute for rapamycin.
Nothing that's potent like that, right? So, that's actually an interesting comparison, right? So again, is berberine as good as metformin in terms of potency? I don't know, but it seems to be real. The effect that berberine has on blood glucose levels, A1C, seems to be real, potentially also through a similar mechanism as metformin. There is no supplement that I believe is a mimic of rapamycin in the sense of being a potent mTOR complex 1 inhibitor. There's a bunch of stuff that people talk about, but when you actually look at the literature, it's very unconvincing that any any doses that are reasonably bioavailable that you're going to get significant mTOR inhibition. So I don't think there's a natural product yet that is a potent mTOR inhibitor like rapamycin.
All right, thank you. So next one is, have you heard of the peptide Epitalon? It seems to extend mouse lifespan by about 50%, but is exclusively the work of a single Russian laboratory. Why?
Yeah, so this falls in the class of things where I don't have a good explanation for why it's been studied the way it has in the literature. So just a little bit of background. So Epitalon is a short peptide. I think it has 4 amino acids that was purified from the pineal gland, and I think it was from cows actually, and the act as potentially the active ingredient of this pineal gland extract. And it's been studied almost exclusively by a group of scientists in St. Petersburg in the Russian Institute of Biogerontology or something like that. So I don't know why it hasn't been studied more broadly outside of that. So from that, at least as far as I know, maybe people have, but I haven't seen it in the literature. So from that group, they reported lifespan extension in flies. They did some studies in mice, some studies in rats. I don't remember seeing a 50% effect, but they did report like small effects on maximum lifespan. And then in a short-lived cancer-prone mouse strain, I think a little bit bigger effect on lifespan. And then they've proposed all sorts of mechanisms. This is the other thing that's complicated, is they keep jumping around, it seems like, to different explanations for how it might be having health benefits. So is it acting as an antioxidant? Is it acting as a telomere lengthener? You know, is it acting as a mitochondrial activator? Is it increasing melatonin production? There's all sorts of hand-wavy explanations. So in sum, I don't know what to believe. What I would say is I haven't seen any what I would consider, very high quality studies showing that it can impact lifespan or health span, even in laboratory animals. It doesn't mean that it can't, but for some reason, nobody outside of this Russian academy has adopted this intervention and taken it forward. And I don't really know why, because like I said, it's a short peptide. Like I think you can buy it over the counter, being no problem to actually do the experiments. And so I'm not sure why it hasn't been tested. So I put in the maybe category, but somebody's got to do the experiment and do it well and show a robust effect before I think people are going to have confidence and know what to believe. I do think more generally, this idea of bioactive peptides, and they can have clearly very profound biological effects, clearly could impact the biology of aging. So as a general class, I'd like to see more people studying bioactive peptides. And specifically, I think this would be an interesting one, that could be tested by the interventions testing program. With the data that's available, I'm not sure it would make the cut. This is a larger conversation. I think that there is a need for some capacity to test more interventions in mice for their effects on lifespan, because the interventions testing program can only test 6 or at most 7 things a year. There's a lot more things that are worth testing that if there was a mechanism in place to support that was very rigorous and well done, I think there'd be a lot of value.
Do you recall if this study passed your 900-day rule for mice?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah, at least the data I've seen. Some of them are in obscure journals where it's hard to get the actual full article, but the experiments I've seen, it was all in shorter lived strains. And so, yeah, that's partly why I discount even that data. The effects didn't seem that impressive, but even that data I discount because it's in the short-lived cancer-prone strain of mice.
Okay. This might be a good time too if you want to just quickly explain the 900-day rule.
Yeah, so conceptually here, the idea is that many of the results that have been published claiming lifespan extension in mice were carried out under conditions where the control strain, not the treated strain with whatever drug you're testing, where the control strain was short-lived for reasons that are unknown. That could be genetic background, it could be poor husbandry, it could be something else, right? So normally we would like to see a longish-lived mouse experiment with the controls in the 800 to 900 day range in terms of their lifespan, untreated. And then you look for extension above that. Many things like nicotinamide riboside is a good example, or metformin is a good example. The studies that claimed lifespan extension were done in experiments where the controls lived 600 days. So 200 days shorter, 250 days shorter than they should have. And the long-lived treatment group ended up being 700 days, which is still shorter than where we would want the controls to be. You see this over and over and over again in the literature where those results often are not reproducible. So in order for me to really feel confident about a lifespan extension, I want to see the treated group be at least 900 days. Even more is better, but that's the 900-day rule, basically.
Yeah.
That's a very, very crude rule of thumb, but it, I think, is important because the field has been fooled by a lot of irreproducible results from these studies where the controls were short-lived. It doesn't mean there can be studies where the controls are short-lived, you get a lifespan extension, and it turns out that's real. So it doesn't mean it's not real, but you have to approach it with a lot of skepticism if that's the case. So that's where this idea of short-lived controls comes in, and the lack of confidence if you see a lifespan extension when the controls were short-lived.
And usually when you see numbers like 50%, it's probably smart to listen to the controlled.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I think it's very, very risky to only look at percent lifespan extension. I get why people do it because it's easy, it's intuitive. But here's the thing. If your controls are short-lived, it is much easier to get a 50% lifespan extension. So again, let's just think about this. If your control animals lived 600 days instead of 900 days, right? And your treatment increased their lifespan to 900 days. That's a 50% increase in lifespan, going from 600 to 900, right? If your controls lived 900 days, you can get that same 300-day increase in lifespan, going from 900 to 1200. That's only a 33% increase in lifespan. This is where the controls make a big difference. When your denominator is smaller, the percent effect is bigger. And so you can get dramatically misled by only looking at percent effect on lifespan.
But taking a mouse from 900 to 1200 is a lot more impressive.
Much more impressive, yeah. Absolutely. Even though the absolute magnitude is the same.
That's important to know. Okay, so next question. So do we have an idea of what instigates aging yet? What do these very long species do differently? Better genes, more copies of certain genes, better epigenetic regulation.
Right. So two things I would say there. The question of do we have an idea of what instigates aging? I mean, again, I would point to the hallmarks of aging as sort of what our current thinking is and just state once again that's incomplete, right? There's more that we don't know than we do know. So yeah, we have some ideas, but there's a lot more to learn. The question about long-lived species. So there's an episode that I'm guessing by the time this comes out will have already come out on body size and aging. And one of the things in that episode is this observation that long-lived species tend to be larger and tend to be longer, right? So if you look across species in the animal kingdom, smaller species are shorter lived and age faster. Larger species are longer lived and age slower. I think that's what this question is getting at. Like, do we have an understanding for that species level difference in lifespan? So I point people to that episode if they want more depth there. I will say my feeling is that the ideas that are out there are pretty unsatisfactory for why it is that larger species tend to live longer. So people will point to things like metabolic rate. So smaller species, when you normalize to body weight, have higher metabolic rate. It's this idea of rate of living. They're just burning fuel faster, essentially. People will point to DNA repair. So it is the case that some long-lived species have better DNA repair. They have more copies of DNA repair enzymes. Whether that is the mechanism for why those species live longer, I think is unclear. And I would suggest that it may be a question of necessary versus sufficient. So if you're a large, long-lived species, almost by definition, you have to have better DNA repair in order to get to reproductive age because you've got more cells. You've got more cells, your likelihood of developing cancer just based on having, 10,000 more cells is 10,000 greater. You have to evolve greater DNA repair to get to reproductive age. So causality there, I think, is tricky. So I would just say no. The answer is no. We don't know why big species live longer and appear to age more slowly than small species do.
So can you explain why we are comfortable with a high-protein diet when protein restriction inhibits mTOR and aging in humans associated with hyperactive mTOR? Would you feel as comfortable with a high protein diet if you were not also taking rapamycin? Most of us cannot access rapamycin. It's extremely difficult to decide whether high or low protein is optimal in aging.
Yeah. So this is a complicated question. I've talked about it on multiple occasions. I don't want to get into the weeds on rapamycin and protein. What I would say is, if we look at those two things separately, I still think the bulk of evidence from human studies suggests that above, again, is it 55? Is it 50? I don't know. Above some age, the benefits of a high protein diet outweigh any increased risk that you have from a high protein diet in terms of cancer or other age-related diseases. The benefits accruing largely likely being body composition, frailty, things like that, functional aspects of aging. Having said that, again, I think people spend way too much time worrying about the amount of protein in the diet and not enough time worrying about the quality of the diet. I think quality of diet trumps whether you're eating a high protein, low protein diet every day of the week. So that's where I would say you should focus your attention first. My view is that for people who are eating a high quality diet, and by that I mean cutting out highly processed foods, cutting out added sugars, things like that. For people who are eating a high quality diet, lots of vegetables, a diet higher in protein is probably net beneficial over a diet low in protein. And again, the evidence I point to for that, and admittedly, it's probabilistic, it's my own opinion, it's a bit of a guess. Evidence I point to that are epidemiological studies suggesting that above that certain age threshold, people eating a higher protein diet do better, all-cause mortality, frailty, things like that. And in the studies that have looked at diet quality, it seems like some of the risks associated with high protein, maybe all of the risks associated with high protein, which are mostly in the realm of cancer, when you control for diet quality, go away. So it's really more the case that people who are eating a lot of red meat, for example, are also tend to eat a poorer quality diet. And when you take that diet quality thing out of the equation, the risks of high protein tend to decline. So the challenge here is you can find evidence to support whatever position you want to take on this. And so I think it's really hard to draw definitive conclusions. So you kind of have to figure out what works for you. But again, I don't think anybody can argue with the idea, get the diet quality piece figured out first, then worry about protein. And then the last thing I would say is, like, I know a bunch of people, like, I've been in this field long enough. I've known people who have tried all sorts of different dietary interventions, caloric restriction, protein restriction, once a day eating, all of that stuff. And this is my own anecdotal view of having seen the changes in those people. The people who adopt a low protein diet, in my view, look sickly and frail. What does that mean? I don't know. They look weak. Okay, so I take that into consideration when I'm making my own decisions on this.
And next to quality, you also have quantity. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Americans are eating low protein, but they're hypercaloric. So at that
Right.
point,
No, you're right. Absolutely. You're right. I tend to, in my own head, equate diet quality also with total caloric consumption, but they don't have to be, but often they are. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah. Over consumption of calories combined with high protein is net worse, almost certainly. And there you can make a really biologically plausible argument, right? So we know protein consumption is associated with insulin-like growth factor 1 levels, growth hormone levels, mTOR activation, although I'm less convinced that a high protein diet robustly activates mTOR across many, many different tissues. Certainly you can find evidence to support that. That's probably the case, that there's some activation of mTOR. So you've got upregulated growth signaling combined with hypercalorie, right, which is probably also going to be inflammatory. That's a bad mix when it comes to all sorts of different age-related diseases. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's not just diet quality, but it's amount of calories being consumed combined with high protein that's probably worse. And in the situation of hypercaloric consumption, low protein is probably better.
Okay. Yep. Speaking personally, I'm kind of cutting some weight for the summer for upcoming DEXA, and I'm high protein, about 200 grams a day, but I'm low calorie. And in the meantime, I feel great. Eventually, if I continue this road, I won't feel great. But I've noticed, like, my Oura ring, like my heart rate is looking lower, and HRV is higher.
Right. Yeah. So again, I think that, and I think being guided by what works for you makes a lot of sense.
All right, next question. What is a good nutritional / vitamin / omega-3 blood test to use?
Yeah. So I think I've mentioned previously on the podcast in the past, before we developed our own blood work here at Optispan, I've used Ulta Labs. I found them to be a really easy way to get the panel you want, schedule your blood work at a local quest, go get it done, and then the data comes back to you. So I don't have any, no conflict of interest, but I've used Ulta Labs. They worked well for me. I will say we're in the process of developing our own Optispan blood test that hopefully at some point we'll be able to make available for people who want it. The idea here is really just to make it as easy as possible. So probably we will have a blood panel. People can go to the website and order, get their results back, and then get recommendations on that. So we've got to figure out all the pieces there. The regulatory environment, you have to work within the appropriate regulatory constraints. But I'm hopeful we'll be able to make that available in the next 3-6 months. And if we do, we'll mention it on the podcast.
Exciting. Do you remember the omega-3 blood test we use?
Yeah, it's called Omega Check.
Omega Check. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How do I ask my general practitioner if rapamycin is something that might be useful for me if they are not experts in this matter?
Yeah. So this is challenging. Again, I think it really depends on your general practitioner and whether they are, somebody who you can have that conversation with, or if there's somebody who 10 minutes each person in and out, right? It's going to be really hard to have that conversation if you're in that sort of, assembly line model for primary care, unfortunately. I think the way I would start is just, ask the question, tell them what you've learned, what you know about rapamycin, some of your sources, and ask them if they have any knowledge. And if they don't, I would suggest be prepared to give them some resources to go look at, right? So, obviously you can recommend the Optispan podcast, but Rapamycin News, I think, is a really good internet site. It's got a lot of resources. I would suggest having a one-pager that, where you've kind of laid out the rationale for why you want to have this conversation. Again, it's really hard to predict how any individual doc is going to respond to that. Many of them will be very dismissive, but you've got to try to have the conversation and then see where it goes.
And maybe shop for a new doctor if needed.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm wondering if caffeine extends lifespan. What about the negative effects that it has on sleep? Doesn't getting a lot of deep sleep help with lifespan and health span? Does the benefits of caffeine outweigh the negative effects it has on sleep?
Yeah. So this is complicated, right? So I know we talked in the episode with George Sutphin about work in C. elegans showing caffeine extends lifespan. And in people, the epidemiology seems to support the idea that caffeine consumption is associated with lower all-cause mortality and decreased risk for at least a subset of age-related diseases. I think we have to be really careful there and recognize, though, there's probably a self-selection going on there, right? The people who consume large amounts of caffeine are probably people who tolerate caffeine better. So it may not be the caffeine itself that is driving the correlation with health outcomes. And again, you can cherry pick individual studies to find whatever you want in this realm of caffeine and health. So taking all of that, here's what I would say. If you are sensitive to caffeine and it negatively impacts your sleep, yes, I would weigh the sleep quality over the caffeine. I personally would suggest that it's probably not, the data is probably not strong enough where I would say you should drink caffeine because it'll increase your lifespan. I don't feel confident about that. I would say if you like coffee, if you like caffeinated tea, I don't think you need to go to decaffeinated because you're worried about the negative effect that caffeine is going to have, unless it's also impacting your sleep quality. And even there's questions around the decaffeination process. Are there some, chemicals that get into the product that might counteract the benefits? It's really freaking complicated. So I would suggest if you are sacrificing sleep quality because you are trying to drink more caffeine, knock it off. If you are drinking caffeinated beverages, hopefully things without sugar, and it's not impacting your sleep quality, great. But I would not go out of my way to drink extra caffeine because I think it's going to give me a longevity benefit.
Yeah. My workaround, my sort of rule is I have a hard cutoff, 10 a.m., no caffeine after that. I go to bed at 8 p.m. and I fall asleep in like 3 to 5 minutes. So it's not an issue. But if I were to do caffeine at 6 p.m., I'd be up all night. So I think people knowing their sort of digestion rate and when they should have that cut
and
off.
it's a very individual thing, right? That some people, I can have coffee at dinner and I don't have any trouble.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Nice. So you don't have a cutoff time?
Not really. No. I mean, I wouldn't drink more than a cup of coffee at dinner, probably. There it might affect me, but it also depends on so much other stuff. Like my sleep quality, I feel like is very much dependent on how much exercise I got that day. Other things are a bigger driver of my sleep quality than whether I have a cup of coffee at dinner.
I think the vicious cycle people need to avoid, though, is you sleep bad, so the next day you have a second energy drink, and you sleep worse, and you have a third, and you kind of get in this cycle.
Yeah, and when it comes to caffeinated drinks, like I think the other thing, which is sort of should be self-evident, but again, worth saying is if you're drinking caffeinated drinks, make sure they're no-calorie caffeinated drinks. Coffee, tea, optimally no sweetener, because otherwise you're just getting empty calories that are usually going to be high in sugar, and you don't need that.
All right. So next question. Won't jelly beans be about 50% fructose? Fructose wouldn't be hitting insulin, would it?
Yeah. So I think this is going back to, I'm guessing it was the Sutphin interview where we talked about the jelly bean experiment with the CGM. So the idea here is you eat, I think it's 20 jelly beans, and it gives you this very nice, robust glucose spike, and then that whether or not that can be somewhat equivalent to a home oral glucose tolerance test. So the question here is, if jelly beans have fructose in them, you're not going to be driving the same insulin response you would get if you were only eating glucose, right? So glucose will cause your body to secrete insulin, which will then decrease blood sugar. So jelly beans, I actually don't know exactly what the ratio of glucose to fructose is in Brock's jelly beans, which is what I think we have settled on. It doesn't actually say, I don't think, on the label. It's going to be a combination of both. I don't know if it's 50-50. There's absolutely going to be glucose in there, so you will get an insulin response. Is it going to be identical to the insulin response you get from pure glucose? Probably not. I think the way I would frame it is, if we're using this as a self-experimentation tool, I don't think it matters as long as it's the same every time. Secondarily, even if it is not as insulinemic as pure glucose or glucola, that doesn't mean that if you do it the same way every time, it can't be just as quantitative for a screening tool for metabolic dysfunction. I'm not claiming that it is, because I don't have that data yet. I suspect that you can use this as a very useful screening tool for metabolic dysfunction independent of the amount of fructose. I think if you were to start trying to compare different brands of jelly beans and all of that, then yeah, it gets complicated. It may not even matter that much. Again, I think you'd have to measure both glucose and insulin and compare, if you did straight glucose, which is going to be glucola, right, to Brock's jelly beans, to, generic Kroger jelly beans. You could measure it and look and see what the glucose response is and the insulin response. Is it going to be different? I don't know. You'd have to do the experiment. So I don't know. Go do the experiment.
Yeah, but we're standardized with the broths.
Yeah, I think, and again, I think it's more a matter of what you're trying to use it for. Like, I'm certainly not suggesting that we will, in our medical practice, if we wanted to do a true oral glucose tolerance test, use jelly beans, right? But I think it can be a tool that might be almost as good from a screening perspective for people when they're doing self-experiments. I don't know that's the case. Again, we haven't actually gone through all the data to determine that, but wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, well, we'll be doing it soon, so that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Oh, here's a good one. So from a thermodynamics perspective, calorie restriction should cause people to lose weight consistently, but I guess this is not the point. Could you please clear my eyes?
Right. Okay. So again, we have to think about what we know from animal studies versus human data. In the laboratory animal studies, which is really the only place where we have strong evidence that caloric restriction is a longevity intervention, we need to look at the rodents, mice and rats. And in those cases, the way those experiments are typically done is you will calculate how much will the animals eat when they're young if they're given free access to food. That's called ad libitum. Okay. Then you back off of that 10%, and that's the control group. Okay. So that's what we're calling the control. And then you go down from there and you restrict it to 60% of that, 50% of that, whatever. And that's caloric restriction. it stays at that level. So we're starting at the level of young animals typically. So 50% caloric restriction would be 50% of that control group, which is 10% less than ad libitum. Okay. You don't change it as they get older. So what happens is that is hypocaloric. The animals are losing weight for some period of time, and then they stabilize. Or typically, this is again, trying to be precise, depends on when you start it. If you start it before they're fully developed, they aren't actually losing weight. They just never reach the same adult body size, right? So if you start it before they're fully developed, the control animals will go up in weight rapidly and end up, up here, let's say. The calorically restricted animals will go up in weight more slowly, and they'll flatten out at a lower adult body weight. If you start it after they're fully developed, the caloric restricted animals will go down in weight. But at some point, they're going to equilibrate, right? And then they just stay there for the rest of their lives. And that's an oversimplification, but close enough. Okay. So the whole point is they are not hypocaloric. They are not eating fewer calories than they need to maintain their body weight over their entire lifespan. This, I think, question is making the assumption that when we talk about caloric restriction, we're talking about always being hypocaloric, always losing weight. Obviously, at some point, that's not sustainable. So that's how the experiments are done. And then I think the question is, when we try to compare that to the human situation, again, I think we want to make the same kind of conceptual relationship. In other words, if we're saying that, what would the equivalent controls be in people, right? Would it be normal weight? Would it be overweight? Would it be obese? I mean, certainly mice in the laboratory, if you feed them ad libitum, will become the mouse equivalent of obese in people. So maybe this, 10% under that, which we would typically use as a control, would be an overweight adult. And so then where does the caloric restriction go from there? I think you could do that sort of calculation to come up with some ideas. But having said that, we don't know that caloric restriction is going to be a longevity intervention in people.
I see. I think the confusion comes from, because you hear Bryan Johnson say he's in a 10, 15% caloric restricted diet. Well, you and I are both about 50 pounds lighter than we were at our heaviest, but we wouldn't say we're calorically restricted compared to then, because we've maintained this weight for many years.
I don't know. Again, it depends on how you want to define it. If you're defining it compared to the way that it has been studied in mice and rats, I might be calorically restricted. I'm not 50% calorically restricted, but I'm certainly at a lower body weight than I would be if I was eating ad libitum, whatever I wanted, right?
Same here.
Again, it's complicated though, because in laboratory mice, they don't have the food choices that we have, right? So they get a very well-defined, diet. I'm not sure. I mean, if you told me that for the rest of your life, you're only going to eat, I don't know, broccoli and carrots, right? Maybe I am at ad libitum if that was my choice, right?
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I don't know that we know the answer, but I think we can, as a guesstimate, say that I not having not done the math, my guesstimate, just back of the envelope calculation, would be, body weight, BMI, as crude as those tools are, that are kind of in the overweight range, is probably equivalent to the mouse controls in a caloric restriction study. And so if you go down from there, you can consider yourself calorically restricted. Maybe it's maybe we should do the math and come back to this. And actually, again, the only reason why I want to be a little bit careful about doing that is I don't want people to then suddenly assume that they can extrapolate from the mouse studies to themselves based on what their BMI is, because I don't know that we can do that. But it's still worth maybe doing the exercise.
This may be crude, but just speaking personally, like my body wants to be 212. So if I'm above 212, I'm trying. If I'm below 212, I'm trying. So maybe you could argue when I'm below 212, I'm in some percent of a calorically restricted diet, at least for myself.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and I mean, this gets into the whole area of set points and all of that. And I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I guess I absolutely have perceived in myself that I gravitate to certain body weight, roughly speaking. But that's very dependent on the diet I'm eating and my exercise level, right? So like right now, I would say, and it's almost like in 10-pound gradations, it seemed like to me. Like most of my adult life, 205, and then I got it down to 195, stayed there for a few years. And then 185 was pretty easy for me to maintain. But most of that is because of diet quality, alcohol consumption, and exercise. And so I think I don't have any trouble, even like right now, I'm not hungry. Uh, and I think I could probably get to a set point at a different level if I stayed in this sort of lifestyle realm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's pretty impressive too, because usually as people get leaner, dieting gets harder psychologically, like
I
fatigue
don't
wise.
consider it dieting though. I consider it more just, well, I don't feel restricted. Maybe that's it. I'm not actively trying to restrict my calories. I have just maybe limited what I eat a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, nice. So our last question is a three-parter, kind of a big one. So want me to read just one part at a time?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So first part. Hi, I have been following your content. I have a question about methylene blue. It seems to be a popular addition to the anti-aging regimen. I came across a study that shows it is directly oxidized glutathione. Would supplementing with MB be counterintuitive to reducing glutathione?
Right. So again, methylene blue is a dye. That's, sounds like it from the name. I'm not super compelled by the evidence that methylene blue is a longevity intervention. So it was actually tested by the interventions testing program in the 2009 cohort, published in 2014, did not extend lifespan. I think that was the same study where they published acarbose did extend lifespan. So it did not show a lifespan extension in the gold standard mouse study from the interventions testing program. I think there have been a couple papers in C. elegans, nematode worms, reporting lifespan extension from methylene blue, both from the same lab. So even there, it hasn't really been reproduced. I think where people hear about methylene blue in the sort of, influencer world is potential effects on cognitive function. Even there, the mouse data is not super compelling from my recollection. So I think in an Alzheimer's disease model, it showed some benefits. In a couple of other neurodegenerative models, it didn't. There was a phase 3 clinical trial for Alzheimer's disease where it did not show any effect. So it doesn't seem like a great candidate for me. Again, it's one of these cases where I can't rule it out, but given the body of evidence, it doesn't seem like something where there's much reason to believe it's a useful longevity molecule. I think people talk about it more in the cosmetic skin aging realm. Most of that's going to be based on experiments in cell culture. The idea is that it can act as a reactive oxygen species scavenger. So I don't know. I don't know, fourth tier? Third to fourth tier. Yeah. Again, not saying there's nothing there. I just haven't seen any data that really makes me enthusiastic about it.
Okay. So
and I'm not sure why if it is a popular longevity supplement, I'm not sure why.
Thank you. So last question. Matt, you are not measuring the terminal half-life of rapamycin
That doesn't sound like a question.
Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah, let's end it there.
It's a comment.
Yeah. It continues. So you can see from the points on your graph in the video that you are actually measuring the initial transient spike at the very beginning. The dynamics of the initial spike characterize the initial half-life of the drug, not the thermal half-life. The 63 hours quoted in the literature is the terminal half-life, not the initial half-life. Rapamycin has a short initial half-life. You need to wait for that transient to settle and reach a steady state. Then you can start measuring the terminal half-life. Please also see my previous comment below, which we don't have.
Okay. So, yeah. So just a little bit of context. So this is from the episode where I talked about some of my experiences on my current cycle of rapamycin. I showed blood measurements from a week after I previously dosed, 2 hours, 4 hours, and 24 hours, I think. And from that, just eyeballing, looked at it and said, this looks shorter than the 63-hour half-life in the literature. So that was the context. I actually did not claim it was the terminal half-life. I would have to go back and listen to the episode, but I am 99% sure I never said the words terminal half-life. So this comment is correct, but also correcting something that I didn't actually say. And I actually think this is important. So probably we'll do a 10-minute, a little bit deeper dive on this. I think that for now, the important thing to appreciate is that the biological clearance of rapamycin, I believe, is going to be fundamentally different in people who are taking a single dose of around 6 milligrams, which is what the majority of people are taking when they're using it off label, compared to people who have used rapamycin as an organ transplant drug or for certain forms of cancer. So the dosing schedule is different. The total amount of drug taken is different. And I believe that the biological clearance and impact are going to be fundamentally different. So what this person is referring to, I believe, is correct. Although, again, it's speculation because nobody's actually shown this. But when you're dosing at, say, 6 milligrams once a week, or like me, 8 milligrams once a week, what seems to be the case is that by the end of the week, depending on how rapidly you personally metabolize the drug, you will be below the detection limit of the assay, which is 1 nanogram per mil, okay? Might be 0, essentially. So when you next take the drug, it is as if your body has not seen the drug the previous week. So what you get is a rapid spike, biological uptake into blood, and then an initial distribution of the drug into presumably tissues and organs, and probably other things are happening as well. We don't actually know the distribution in different tissues and organs in this context. That's where you see this first dramatic clearance out of the blood. That happens very rapidly. And then what this person is referring to is if you then took another dose, bumped your rapamycin back up, you would then see a slower clearance from the blood because you've already done that initial uptake, okay? That's what you see in organ transplant patients. That's where you get this 60-ish hour half-life. It's fundamentally different, though, for that first dose, even in organ transplant patients. And the point I think I was trying to make, and I admit I did not do a good job of going into, I harp about trying to be precise in the way I talk about these things. I did not do a good job of being precise in how I talked about this in that episode. The point I was trying to make is that in people who are dosing once a week, it's different. And so you do see a dramatically different clearance of rapamycin from the blood, and probably a very different impact on mTOR signaling in tissues and organs, right? And so this is where it gets speculative because we can't measure mTOR signaling in tissues and organs in real time in human beings at this point. But I would suspect that if you think about different tissues and organs, there's going to be certain tissues where you're going to get more rapamycin uptake and more mTOR inhibition than others, like liver, probably pretty significant, brain, less so. So this is where you get into the idea of if you're doing it weekly at 6 milligrams once a week, are you actually getting any effective mTOR inhibition in the brain? I don't know. So I know I went off on a little bit of tangent there. I think the difference is terminal half-life is referring to the rate of clearance of rapamycin once you've done that initial uptake, right? That's much more relevant in organ transplant patients than it is in most people who are going to be dosing rapamycin once a week. And so what I was referring to was the half-life in the blood, which I don't think I was way off. Again, I'd have to go do the math. I will, in my estimate. So I think one interesting additional point I will leave you with, as I kind of made a joking, reference to, because Bryan Johnson has shared his rapamycin, he was using a higher dose, and I, threw down the gauntlet for who can clear their rapamycin the fastest. That was a joke, by the way, people. Okay, when I laugh, I'm joking. It is interesting because he used a higher dose of rapamycin. So if I had taken, instead of 8 milligrams, let's say 20 milligrams, I very well might have seen a blood clearance kinetics that looked more similar to his, because if you think about it in 2 phases, there's this initial rapid uptake. Let's say that sucks half the dose out of the blood. Then there's going to be this slower decline with the other half of the dose. I would have to do the experiment exactly the way he did to find out, right? Maybe I should. Maybe that'll be a good experiment for the future. But all of this is just to say the main point is that I think the clearance of rapamycin, probably even the terminal half-life, is going to be very different in people dosing at the sort of off-label potential health span doses versus organ transplant doses.
Yeah, I think that clears that up.
Thank you for that comment.
Yes. Yeah, I kind of want to just thank the audience for their support so far. This has been great. I'm looking forward to the 10K special we have.
Keep those questions coming. It's been a lot of fun. I like the challenging questions. So, I'm happy to talk about anything you guys want to talk about. Keep them coming.
All right. Thank you for watching this episode of the Optispan podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Please take a second, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you have a question, put it in the comments below, and I'll make sure to pull it for our next AMA episode.